Thranduil, the Elven King of Mirkwood, was a figure of majesty and wisdom, but also one with a guarded heart and a profound sense of duty to his people. His kingdom lay on the northern fringes of a world that was increasingly threatened by the encroaching darkness of Sauron's power. As the influence of the Dark Lord grew, Thranduil's realm found itself beset by orcs, giant spiders, and the oppressive shadow that spread from Dol Guldur, the fortress hidden in southern Mirkwood. The elves of his kingdom, already few in number, were slowly retreating deeper into the heart of their forest, isolating themselves from the wider world. It is within this context that Thranduil might encounter the One Ring. The One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom, had long been lost to the world. However, had it come into Thranduil's possession, perhaps discovered by a wandering company of elves patrolling the darkened borders of his woodland realm, it would present him with an irresistible temptation. Thranduil was not driven by the same petty ambitions of lesser men, nor was he one to covet power for its own sake. His motives were, at least on the surface, pure. He sought to protect his people, to keep the forces of darkness at bay, and to preserve the ancient and fading beauty of the woodland kingdom he ruled. The One Ring, with its promise of absolute power, would seem to offer a solution to the growing menace of Sauron. It was a power that could be wielded to protect Mirkwood from further corruption. Thranduil would have been keenly aware of the dangers the ring posed, yet even the wisest of beings could fall prey to its seductive allure. As he held the ring, perhaps found abandoned in the wilderness, or taken from the grasp of an ill-fated traveler, its simple golden exterior would mask the unrelenting desire that lay beneath. Thranduil would feel a rising sense of purpose, a belief that only he could harness its power for good. After all, who else had the strength, the wisdom, and the right to wield such a weapon? He might rationalize that, unlike men, or even the other elven rulers, he had the clarity of vision to resist the corrupting influence of the ring. He was, in his own mind, incorruptible. But even as Thranduil clutched the One Ring in his hand, perhaps before he even placed it upon his finger, he would feel its pull. The ring was more than a mere object of power. It was the very manifestation of Sauron's will, a fragment of his dark soul. Thranduil would find his thoughts drifting ever more frequently to the power the ring promised, and the sacrifices he might make to protect his people. Once Thranduil claims the ring, it would mark the beginning of his transformation. The Elven King, long known for his aloofness and cold detachment, would slowly become consumed by the desire to control and dominate. His once noble intentions would twist under the ring's influence, and the isolation that had once defined his rule would deepen into something darker and more malevolent. In the early stages, Thranduil might be able to convince himself and those around him that nothing had changed. He would still present the image of a wise and measured leader, but underneath, the ring would begin to alter his very essence. Elves are long-lived and highly resistant to many forms of corruption, but the One Ring was crafted to dominate even the strongest of wills. As Thranduil continued to wear it, he would find his mind increasingly filled with thoughts of power and control. He might see himself as a rightful ruler not just of Mirkwood, but of all Elvendom, perhaps even all of Middle-earth. His pride, already significant, would be magnified 100-fold. The isolationist tendencies that had once kept him detached from the world would morph into a dangerous sense of superiority. Thranduil would begin to view not only the forces of evil as his enemies, but also those who opposed his vision for Middle-earth, including his own allies. The elves of Mirkwood would notice the change in their king, though slowly. At first it would manifest in subtle ways. Thranduil might become more secretive, more suspicious of those around him, even his closest advisors. His court, once a place of serene elegance, would become darker, more oppressive, as the Elven King's presence grew more domineering. His once wise counsel would give way to imperious commands, and the joy that his people had long found in the natural beauty of their forest home would be tainted by the looming shadow of their ruler's obsession. As the ring took deeper hold of him, Thranduil's decisions would become increasingly ruthless. Mirkwood, already a kingdom in decline, would begin to suffer even more under the weight of the Elven King's ambitions. He would strengthen the borders of his realm, turning away any who sought aid, even those from the neighboring lands of men or dwarves. His once great hall, where he had hosted travelers like Thorin Oakenshield and his company, would become a fortress of isolation, closed off to the outside world. The elves of Mirkwood, once known for their grace and hospitality, would become mistrustful and reclusive, mirroring the growing darkness in their king's heart. Thranduil's desire to protect Mirkwood would drive him to greater and more extreme measures. Under the influence of the ring, he might launch campaigns against the forces of Dol Guldur, not out of a sense of duty or alliance with the Free Peoples, but out of a desire to establish his dominance over the entire region. He would see the Dark Fortress as a threat not only to Mirkwood, but to his own growing ambitions. In doing so, he might achieve early victories, as the power of the ring allowed him to crush Sauron's forces with ease. But each victory would come at a cost, further eroding the goodness in Thranduil's soul and solidifying his belief that he alone had the right to rule over Middle-earth. As Thranduil's influence expanded, Mirkwood itself would begin to change. The once beautiful forest, already tainted by the darkness spreading from Dol Guldur, would be consumed by a new, more insidious form of corruption. While Sauron's shadow had brought decay and despair, the Elven King's new dominion would bring with it an oppressive order. The trees might remain standing, the rivers flowing, but there would be a palpable sense of fear and control over the land. The creatures of Mirkwood, already wild and dangerous, would become twisted reflections of their former selves, enslaved to the will of their king. Though Thranduil might initially see himself as a liberator of his people, it would soon become clear to those around him that the Elven King was no longer the benevolent ruler they had once known. The ring's influence would isolate him not just from the world beyond Mirkwood, but from his own people. Any who opposed his rule would be cast out or silenced, and his court would become a place of fear and suspicion. Thranduil's pride would lead him to believe that his vision for Mirkwood was the only one that mattered, and any dissent would be seen as a betrayal. Thus, while Mirkwood might initially benefit from Thranduil's new power, the cost would soon become unbearable. The Elven King's once noble desire to protect his realm would be consumed by the same desire for control and domination that had corrupted so many before him. In the end, Mirkwood would not be a kingdom saved from the shadow of Sauron, but one that had traded one dark ruler for another. The balance of power in Middle-earth would shift dramatically once word spread that Thranduil, the Elven King of Mirkwood, had claimed the One Ring. The ripple effects of such a monumental event would extend far beyond the borders of his woodland realm, altering the dynamics between elves, men, dwarves, and even the forces of Sauron himself. At the heart of these changes would be a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and conflicts, as the various races and factions of Middle-earth responded to this new and dangerous power in the hands of the Elven King. The elves of Middle-earth, though bound by shared history and ancient ties, were divided into different realms, each with its own rulers, priorities, and challenges. Thranduil's relationship with the other elven leaders, particularly Galadriel and Elrond, was already strained by his isolationist policies. Thranduil had long kept his distance from the affairs of Lothlorien and Rivendell, focusing instead on his own kingdom. However, the news that he had taken the One Ring would send shockwaves through the elven communities. Galadriel, one of the most powerful and wise of the elves, would be immediately alarmed by the news. She had long understood the dangers posed by the One Ring, having resisted its temptation when Frodo offered it to her. Galadriel's own wisdom and foresight would lead her to see the growing danger in Thranduil's actions, though she would likely seek to counsel him. Offering her advice as an ally and fellow ruler, she would also be wary of the threat that a corrupted Thranduil posed. Unlike men, elves are resistant to the passage of time, and Galadriel would know that the longer Thranduil possessed the One Ring, the more deeply its corruption would take root in his mind. Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, would share Galadriel's concerns. Elrond had seen the rise and fall of many powerful leaders, and he understood the ring's capacity to corrupt even the noblest of hearts. He had fought alongside Isildur during the War of the Last Alliance, and had witnessed firsthand how the One Ring had corrupted the heir of Gondor. Like Galadriel, Elrond would likely attempt to reach out to Thranduil, hoping to prevent a catastrophic turn of events. However, Thranduil, in his newfound arrogance and growing obsession with power, would likely view such counsel as interference, if not outright hostility. He would see Elrond and Galadriel not as allies, but as rivals, potentially seeking to claim the One Ring for themselves. This suspicion would drive a wedge between the elven kingdoms, further isolating Thranduil and making cooperation against the rising threat of Sauron more difficult. As tensions among the elves increased, the human kingdoms of Middle-earth would also be deeply affected by Thranduil's claim to the One Ring. The kingdom of Gondor, led by whichever steward or king ruled at the time of Thranduil's rise to power, would be faced with a difficult decision. Gondor had long stood as a bulwark against the forces of Mordor, and the One Ring represented a power that could tip the balance in either direction. On the one hand, Gondor might see Thranduil's newfound strength as a potential ally in their ongoing struggle against Sauron. With the power of the One Ring, Thranduil could amass a force capable of striking at the heart of Mordor, perhaps even vanquishing Sauron once and for all. However, Gondor's rulers would also recognize the inherent danger in trusting someone who had claimed the One Ring. The steward or king would likely be aware of Isildur's fall and would fear that Thranduil too would be consumed by the ring's power. Gondor, ever vigilant against the threats to its sovereignty, would not easily align itself with a ruler who had succumbed to such a corrupting force. This uncertainty would likely lead to a period of mistrust between Gondor and Mirkwood, with both sides hesitant to commit to an alliance. Gondor might send emissaries to Thranduil's court, seeking assurances of his intentions, but these diplomatic overtures would be met with suspicion by the Elven King, whose growing paranoia would prevent any meaningful dialogue. In the north, the kingdom of Rohan would face a similar dilemma. Though Rohan's interests lay primarily in the defense of its own lands against the forces of Isengard and Mordor, the riders of Rohan had a history of alliance with Gondor and shared their concerns about the One Ring. The Rohirrim, proud and independent, would be unlikely to trust Thranduil, especially as the shadow of the ring's influence grew over him. The king of Rohan might even see Thranduil's claim to the ring as a prelude to an elven domination of all Middle-earth, something the fiercely independent horse lords would never accept. The dwarves, however, would be the first to react strongly against Thranduil's claim to the One Ring. The long-standing animosity between the elves of Mirkwood and the dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills was well known, and the history between Thranduil and the dwarves was fraught with tension. During the quest of Erebor, Thranduil had imprisoned Thorin Oakenshield and his company, and relations between the two peoples had never fully healed. The dwarves, ever suspicious of elven motives, would view Thranduil's acquisition of the One Ring as an existential threat to their own sovereignty. Thorin's descendants, along with Dain Ironfoot, might even consider the possibility that Thranduil, empowered by the ring, would seek to reclaim Erebor for himself or attempt to dominate the dwarves through sheer force. The One Ring, after all, was not just a weapon of war. It was a tool of control, capable of bending the wills of others to the bearer's desires. The dwarves, stubborn and proud as they were, would not submit willingly to such domination. This could lead to a resurgence of conflict between the dwarves and elves, as both sides prepared for the possibility of war. Tensions might escalate as the dwarves fortified their mountain strongholds, preparing for a potential invasion by Thranduil's forces. Trade routes between Mirkwood and Erebor, already tenuous, would be severed, and diplomatic relations would deteriorate rapidly. The dwarves might even consider forming alliances with other kingdoms, such as the Men of Dale or Gondor, in a bid to counterbalance Thranduil's growing power. The mistrust and enmity between the two races would deepen, further fracturing the fragile alliances that had been formed during the earlier wars against Sauron. But the most significant and dangerous response to Thranduil's claim to the One Ring would come from Sauron himself. The Dark Lord, whose power was intrinsically tied to the One Ring, would be acutely aware that another had taken his most prized creation. Sauron's connection to the ring allowed him to sense its presence, and he would immediately turn his attention to Mirkwood, seeing Thranduil not as a potential ally, but as a rival to be crushed. The Dark Lord's armies, already massing in preparation for a final assault on Gondor and the free peoples of Middle-earth, would shift their focus to Mirkwood, intent on reclaiming the ring at any cost. Sauron's Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, would be dispatched to track down the One Ring and bring it back to their master. They would haunt the borders of Mirkwood, probing for weaknesses in Thranduil's defenses. The Elven King, knowing the true extent of Sauron's power, would be forced to bolster his borders and prepare for an all-out assault. This would drain Mirkwood's resources, further isolating the elves from potential allies. Thranduil, in his pride and paranoia, would likely reject offers of assistance from other kingdoms, believing that only he, with the power of the One Ring, could defeat Sauron's forces. As the armies of Mordor and Dol Guldur closed in on Mirkwood, the stage would be set for a massive and cataclysmic battle. Sauron, knowing that his power depended on reclaiming the ring, would stop at nothing to crush Thranduil and take back his creation. The Elven King, meanwhile, would be consumed by his desire to keep the ring for himself, believing that he could wield its power to defeat Sauron and establish a new order in Middle-earth. In the end, Thranduil's claim to the One Ring would fracture the alliances between elves, men, and dwarves, leaving the free peoples divided at a time when unity was most needed. The Elven King's pride, paranoia, and obsession with power would drive away potential allies and sow mistrust across Middle-earth, making it all the more difficult to resist the rising tide of darkness. And as the armies of Sauron closed in on Mirkwood, the fate of the entire world would hang in the balance, as the forces of good stood divided against a common enemy, and the corrupting influence of the One Ring continued to spread its dark tendrils across the land. As the final act of Thranduil's possession of the One Ring unfolds, the fate of Middle-earth stands on a knife's edge. The events leading up to this moment have caused rifts and tensions between the free peoples, while Sauron's forces continue to gather strength. Thranduil's grasp on power has brought his realm of Mirkwood to the brink of war, and the once noble Elven King has been transformed by the corrupting influence of the One Ring into a shadow of his former self. Powerful, yes, but driven by paranoia, ambition, and a growing obsession with dominance. Thranduil's immediate priority would be to fortify his kingdom against Sauron's inevitable assault. He would rally his forces, calling upon every able-bodied elf in Mirkwood to defend their homeland. The once beautiful forest would become a militarized zone, with sentries posted at every border, battalions of elven warriors training relentlessly, and Thranduil's court transformed into a war council. His focus would not only be on defending his kingdom from external threats, but also on consolidating his rule. Any dissent among his own people would be swiftly silenced, as the Elven King could no longer tolerate opposition. Even those closest to him, his most trusted advisors and captains, would begin to fear the consequences of questioning his decisions. The once majestic halls of the woodland realm, known for their natural beauty and serenity, would become a place of fear and intrigue as Thranduil grew more isolated from his people. Sauron, aware that his most precious creation was now in the hands of an elven lord, would not hesitate to act. He had already dispatched his Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, to locate the One Ring, and they would continue their relentless pursuit of Thranduil. The forces of Dol Guldur, located in the southern reaches of Mirkwood, would intensify their assaults, sending orcs, wargs and other foul creatures to harry the borders of the Elven King's realm. These skirmishes, while not the full force of Sauron's army, would serve to weaken Mirkwood's defenses and draw Thranduil's attention to the immediate threat at his doorstep. However, the true danger lay in Mordor, where Sauron was preparing for a full-scale assault on the Elven King. As Sauron's forces massed, the question of alliances would become increasingly urgent. Thranduil's refusal to ally with the other free peoples had left Mirkwood vulnerable, and despite his immense power, even he could not hold off the forces of Mordor alone. The other elven realms, Lothlorien and Rivendell, might have considered offering aid, but Thranduil's growing arrogance and mistrust would make such cooperation difficult. Galadriel and Elrond, wary of the One Ring's corrupting influence, would be reluctant to directly involve themselves in Thranduil's war, fearing that aiding him might only strengthen the grip of the ring on his mind. Meanwhile, the kingdoms of men and dwarves would be watching with concern. Gondor and Rohan, embroiled in their own battles against Sauron's forces, would be hesitant to send aid to Mirkwood. Though they recognized the strategic importance of Mirkwood's position, they could not risk thinning their own defenses when the armies of Mordor were poised to strike at their gates. The dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills, still distrustful of Thranduil due to their long-standing enmity, would be even less likely to offer assistance. The isolation Thranduil had fostered would now come back to haunt him as he faced the growing threat of annihilation without allies to stand beside him. The great battle for Mirkwood would soon begin as Sauron unleashed the full might of his forces. Armies of orcs, trolls, and other creatures of darkness would march from Mordor and Dol Guldur, converging on the Elven King's realm. The skies above Mirkwood would darken as the Nazgul, mounted on their terrifying fell beasts, circled above, seeking the One Ring. Thranduil, emboldened by his belief in the power of the ring, would lead his forces personally into battle. In his mind, he would see himself as the savior of his people, the one who could finally destroy Sauron and bring peace to Middle-earth. But in reality, the ring's influence would have twisted his judgment, clouding his mind with delusions of grandeur and absolute power. The battle itself would be a cataclysmic event, unlike any other conflict seen in Middle-earth for centuries. Thranduil, wielding the One Ring, would unleash devastating power upon Sauron's forces. His mastery of magic, combined with the ring's ability to control and dominate, would make him a formidable opponent. Elven arrows would rain down upon the orcs, cutting through their ranks with deadly precision, while the Elven King himself would wield powers that no elf had ever dared to command. Trees and roots from the forest might come to life under his command, ensnaring and crushing Sauron's armies. The once great forests of Mirkwood would become a battleground where nature itself was bent to the will of the Elven King. Yet, for all his strength, the One Ring's influence would continue to erode Thranduil's morality. His tactics, once focused on defending his people, would become increasingly ruthless and destructive. He might seek to enslave the minds of his enemies, bending them to his will, or even attempt to dominate the Nazgul themselves, an impossibility given their eternal servitude to Sauron. His desire for victory would become a desire for domination, and soon, his concern for the well-being of his people would fade, replaced by a single-minded obsession with power. Thranduil, once a wise and noble ruler, would now be a figure of tyranny, commanding his armies with an iron fist. The elves of Mirkwood, though loyal to their king, would begin to sense the change in him. They had fought for centuries to protect their realm from the encroaching darkness, but now they would find themselves questioning the very nature of the power their king wielded. Some might begin to wonder whether Thranduil had become as great a threat to Middle-earth as Sauron himself. Dissent would grow within the ranks, and though no one would dare to openly defy their king, whispers of rebellion and fear would spread throughout the kingdom. The elves, long known for their resilience and unity, would now be divided, unsure whether they were fighting for their survival or for the ambitions of a ruler who had fallen into darkness. As the battle raged on, Sauron's forces would not be so easily defeated. The Dark Lord, bound to the One Ring, would have a direct connection to Thranduil's mind. He would sense the Elven King's growing instability and would exploit it, sending his Nazgul to confront him personally. The Ringwraiths, immune to most forms of physical harm, would strike terror into the hearts of Thranduil's forces. Even with the power of the ring, Thranduil would find himself tested to the limits of his strength as the Nazgul sought to reclaim their master's treasure. The final confrontation between Thranduil and Sauron would be inevitable. Sauron, though still without a physical form, would exert his will through the ring, using it to manipulate Thranduil's thoughts and actions. The Elven King, already teetering on the edge of madness, would feel the full force of Sauron's presence pressing down upon him. In his mind, Thranduil might believe that he could defeat Sauron once and for all, using the ring's power to destroy the Dark Lord and claim Middle-earth for himself. But the ring's true purpose was always to serve Sauron, and its influence would work against Thranduil in subtle, insidious ways. In the climactic moment, Thranduil would be forced to make a choice: continue to fight Sauron, knowing that the ring was slowly corrupting him, or relinquish the ring and save what remained of his kingdom. The One Ring's pull would be nearly irresistible, and Thranduil, having been consumed by its power for so long, might find himself unable to let it go. His pride, his desire for control, and his belief in his own superiority would all drive him to hold on to the ring, even as it destroyed him. But if Thranduil chose to keep the ring, the consequences would be dire. The Elven King, no longer the protector of his people, would become a new Dark Lord in his own right, a twisted reflection of Sauron. His obsession with power would lead him to wage war not only against Sauron, but against any who opposed him. The elves of Mirkwood, once noble and free, would be reduced to pawns in Thranduil's quest for dominance. The beautiful forest kingdom would be transformed into a fortress of tyranny, where fear and oppression reigned. Sauron, however, would not be easily defeated. Even if Thranduil managed to fend off the Dark Lord's immediate assault, Sauron's presence would continue to grow, and eventually he would reclaim the One Ring, whether through Thranduil's eventual fall or through betrayal from within. In the end, the power of the One Ring would always return to its master, and Thranduil's fate would be sealed. If, by some miracle, Thranduil were to relinquish the ring before it was too late, the story might end differently. He would be left broken, a shadow of his former self, having glimpsed the true extent of the darkness that lay within him. His kingdom, too, would be scarred by the conflict, and the elves of Mirkwood would have to rebuild their shattered lives. But the ring would still be out there, waiting for another to claim it, and the cycle of corruption and power would continue as long as the One Ring existed. In the end, Thranduil's claim to the One Ring would lead to a final, inevitable conclusion: that no one, not even the wisest and noblest of Middle-earth's rulers, could wield such power without being consumed by it. The fate of Middle-earth and of Thranduil himself would be a tragic reminder of the corrupting nature of absolute power and the eternal struggle between light and darkness.